In 1869, on an island at the northern edge of Japan, a French artillery officer stood inside a star-shaped fort and waited to lose. Around him were 3,000 men who were already beaten, and outside was 7,000 who had already won. He had resigned from the French army to be there, and he had ignored a direct order from his own government to do it. He was fighting for a country that was not his, for a government that no longer existed, in a war that was already over. This is the man Hollywood turned into Tom Cruise. His name was Jules Brunet. He was not a samurai. He was a captain from Belfort who finished 68th out of 120 at the École Polytechnique and who drew pictures in his spare time. And when France ordered him home, he sat down and wrote to the Emperor of France to explain why he would not be coming. Then he went home anyway and became a general. Jules Brunet was born in Belfort in January 1838, and he was not born into the military aristocracy that filled the French officer corps. He worked his way in. Saint-Cyr first, then the École Polytechnique, where he graduated 68th out of 120 students, which is to say he was competent and unremarkable. Then artillery school at Metz, where something changed, and he finished 4th in his course. Artillery in that decade was the closest thing the world had to applied science. Guns were getting rifled barrels and ranges were doubling, so an officer who understood mathematics could now kill men at distances that had been impossible 10 years earlier. Brunet understood mathematics. France sent him to Mexico. Napoleon III had decided to install a European emperor on a Mexican throne, and the Mexicans disagreed. At the siege of Puebla, Brunet did something the records describe only as service with distinction, and Napoleon III personally awarded him the Cross of the Legion of Honor. By 1867, he was a captain of artillery and a Knight of the Legion of Honor. He also drew. This is the detail that gets left out of the story, and it should not be, because Brunet was a working artist who sketched the places he was sent to and the people he was sent to fight. French newspapers published him. He drew Mexican towns, and he would later draw Japanese sailors, Tokugawa infantry marching under Mount Fuji, and an assassination attempt on a British envoy in Kyoto that ran in Le Monde Illustre. So the man who arrives in Japan is not a mercenary and not a romantic. He is a professional gunner with a war behind him and a sketchbook in his bag. He landed in January 1867. Japan at that moment had 2 governments and did not know it yet. Officially, the country was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, which had held power for more than 250 years. But in practice, the shogunate was dying, and everyone involved could feel it. The shogun's answer was to modernize, fast. He asked France for help, and France sent a military mission of 15 men, 5 of them officers, under a captain named Charles Chanoine. Remember that name, because it comes back at the end of this story in a way you will not expect. Brunet's job was horse artillery, which meant teaching Japanese soldiers how to move guns at speed, how to sight them, and how to calculate a firing solution. His students were samurai and the sons of samurai, men who had grown up inside a warrior culture that was about to be declared obsolete. He was good at it, and more importantly, they liked him. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. Almost every European sent to Asia in that decade arrived convinced he was there to civilize somebody, while Brunet seems to have arrived thinking he was there to teach artillery. He learned the names, he drew the men, he stayed in the barracks. And then, in January 1868, the shogunate lost. The forces of Satsuma and Choshu moved on Kyoto, and at Toba Fushimi, an imperial army roughly a third the size of the shogunate's force broke it completely, starting the war we now call the Boshin War. Brunet was there, and some of the men who died there were men he had trained. By spring, the shogun had surrendered Edo, and by summer, the new imperial government was consolidating. Then somebody in Paris looked at a map and decided France had backed the losing side. In late September 1868, the order arrived. The French military mission was to leave Japan, on 2 ships sailing in October. Every officer in the mission understood what that meant. The men they had trained were now rebels. The government they had been sent to strengthen no longer existed, and their students were going to be hunted while France sailed away and let it happen. Most of them packed. On the 4th of October 1868, Jules Brunet wrote a letter to the French Minister of War, Adolphe Niel. It is short and it is very deliberate. I have the honor of presenting to you my resignation from the rank of captain. I declare that from this 4th of October 1868, I renounce the prerogatives of the position of artillery officer in the French army. Read that again. He is not requesting leave, and he is not asking for permission. He is removing himself from the French army, so that when he does what he is about to do, France cannot be blamed for it. He was 30 years old. He had the Legion of Honor. He had a career that was clearly going somewhere, and he gave all of it up in 1 paragraph. Then he wrote a second letter to Napoleon III himself, and this one tells you what he thought he was doing. A revolution is forcing the military mission to return to France. Alone I stay. Alone I wish to continue, under new conditions. The daimyos of the north have offered me to be its soul. I have accepted because with the help of 1,000 Japanese officers and non-commissioned officers, our students, I can direct the 50,000 men of the Confederation. 1,000 officers, 50,000 men. He believed he could win. So what does a man actually think he is doing when he writes that? He was not delusional, and he was not suicidal, and he had just come from a war where he watched a European army install a government by force. He thought this was the same problem with the same solution, and he was wrong, and he was about to spend 9 months finding out exactly how wrong. If you are still here, you already know this does not end well, and you are watching anyway, which is the right instinct. Subscribe, because the next one is about the man who fought this same war from the opposite side. The remnants of the shogun's navy had already made their decision. In August 1868, Admiral Enomoto Takeaki sailed out of Shinagawa with 4 steam warships, 4 transports, and roughly 2,000 men, rather than hand the fleet over to the new government. It was the strongest naval force in Japan, and he simply took it. The sea took some of it straight back. A typhoon hit the next day, 1 ship was lost, and another, the Kanrin Maru, was captured. What survived reached Sendai at the end of the month. At Sendai, the fleet became something larger. Defeated units from across northern Japan came aboard, and so did 3 more French officers who had walked away from the training mission: Arthur Fortin, Jean Marlin, and François Bouffier, along with André Cazeneuve, who had stayed with Brunet from the start. And so did a man named Hijikata Toshizo. You need to know who Hijikata was. He was born in 1835, the youngest of 10 children in a village in Musashi Province, and his father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. He sold his family's medicine door to door and taught himself to use a sword before he ever entered a proper school, and he rose to become vice commander of the Shinsengumi, the shogunate's police unit in Kyoto. His own men called him the Demon Vice Commander because he enforced the unit's rules by killing the men who broke them, including his own friends. He had been fighting and losing for a year. He got on the boat. By October, the force numbered around 3,000, and that month they landed at Washinoki Bay, behind Hakodate. 6 days later, they took Goryokaku, a star-shaped fortress built in the European style, all angles and overlapping fields of fire, the most modern fort in Japan. It became their capital. And then they did something nobody expected. They held an election. In December 1868, the officers of a defeated army, sitting in a fort on an island most Japanese had never visited, voted for a government. Enomoto Takeaki was elected president, and Matsudaira Taro vice president. Arai Ikunosuke took the navy, and Otori Keisuke took the army. Hijikata Toshizo, the demon vice commander, the man who had spent 5 years enforcing feudal discipline with a sword, was made Deputy Minister of Defense by ballot. Historians still argue about what to call this. Some call it the first election in Japanese history, while others point out that only officers voted, that it was a military junta with a ceremony attached, and that the whole thing lasted 7 months. Both readings are defensible. What is not in dispute is what happened to Jules Brunet inside it. He became the de facto foreign minister of the Republic of Ezo and second in command of its army under Otori Keisuke, while 4 of the French officers each took command of a brigade. A man who had resigned his commission 6 weeks earlier was now running the foreign policy of a country that had existed for a fortnight. Their first move was to ask the world to recognize them. So Nagai Naoyuki, the magistrate at Hakodate, went to the foreign legations. The British were there, the French were there, the Americans were there. Nobody was interested. The Western powers had spent 15 years trying to work out who actually ran Japan, and they had just been given a clear answer. The Meiji government held Kyoto, Edo, the emperor, and the trade treaties, while Ezo held 1 island, 8 ships, and 3,000 men, and there was no argument to make. So the Republic of Ezo entered 1869 as the recognized government of precisely nowhere, waiting for spring when the ice would clear and the imperial fleet would come. They decided not to wait. The Imperial Navy had bought an American ironclad called the Kotetsu, an armored ship that nothing in the Ezo fleet could sink in a straight fight. So how do you beat a ship you cannot sink? You do not fight it, you steal it. On the 20th of March 1869, 3 Ezo ships move on Miyako Bay, where the Kotetsu lies at anchor, with Hijikata Toshizo aboard. The plan is to board her, take her deck, and sail her out of the harbour. Storms scatter the squadron, and only 1 ship, the Kaiten, arrives. She enters flying an American flag. She gets close. She hauls down the American colours and raises her own, and the boarding party goes over the side onto the ironclad's deck, swords out, at dawn, in the middle of an anchored enemy fleet. And then the Kotetsu's crew opens up with a Gatling gun. This is 1869. The boarding party is doing something men had done for 1,000 years, jumping onto an enemy deck with a blade. And the answer is a hand-cranked machine gun firing into a space they cannot get out of. The kaiten pulls away and the attackers are cut to pieces. That is the moment, if you want one, when the samurai era actually ends. Not on a hill in 1877, but on a wet deck in a northern harbour against a weapon that did not care how brave anyone was. The Imperial force landed in April 1869, 7,000 infantry against roughly 3,000 defenders. From there, it is arithmetic. The Ezo forces lose Matsumai, they lose Esashi, and they are pushed back through Futamata toward Hakodate until everything they have left is the fort, the harbour battery at Benten Daiba, and the town in between. On the 20th of June 1869, Hijikata Toshizo rode out toward the Ippongi Gate to break through to the men trapped at Benten Daiba. A bullet hit him in the lower back and shattered it, and he died on the road, on horseback, 34 years old. He had already written his death poem. Though my body may decay on the island of Ezo, my spirit guards my lord in the east. Brunet did not die at Hakodate, and it is worth being honest about how he got out. In June 1869, before the surrender, the French officers were taken off. A French Navy corvette, the Coetlogon, under Abel Nicolas Bergas du Petit-Thouars, was sitting in Hakodate Bay, and the advisors went aboard and were carried to Yokohama. The men they had trained stayed and finished it. Enomoto Takeaki surrendered on the 26th of June 1869 and handed over Goryokaku the next day to a Satsuma officer named Kuroda Kiyotaka. The Republic of Ezo had lasted about 7 months. Brunet's own government was waiting for him. He was arrested in Yokohama by the new French plenipotentiary, Maxime d'Autray, and shipped to Saigon aboard the Duplex like cargo. Then the Japanese government formally demanded that France punish him. France refused, and here is the part that decides the rest of his life. By the time the demand arrived, the French public had already read the story of the officer who resigned rather than abandon the men he trained. He was popular, and punishing him was politically impossible. In February 1870, the French army simply took him back. His penalty for resigning his commission, joining a foreign rebellion, and waging war against a government France recognized was a 6-month suspension and a small loss of seniority. 5 months after that, France went to war with Prussia. Brunet fought at Spicheren, at Mars-la-Tour, and at Gravelotte, 3 of the hardest battles of a war France lost badly, and he was captured with the rest of the army when Metz surrendered. In 1871, he was made an officer of the Legion of Honor and appointed aide-de-camp to the Minister of War. And then he simply kept going. Military attaché in Rome, colonel of an artillery regiment, brigade general, and general of division by 1898. Now Japan changes its mind. In May 1881, 12 years after demanding his punishment, the Japanese government awarded Jules Brunet the Order of the Rising Sun. More decorations followed, and in 1895 he was made a Grand Officer of the Order of the Sacred Treasure, with the ceremonies held at the Japanese embassy in Paris. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, sent him 3 swords. The men he fought beside did better than that. Enomoto Takeaki was arrested for high treason and should have been executed, but Kuroda Kiyotaka, the officer who had accepted his surrender, argued for his life so hard that he reportedly shaved his own head over it. Inomoto was pardoned in 1872 and then became a vice admiral in the navy he had fought against, ambassador to Russia, navy minister, communications minister, education minister, foreign minister, and minister of agriculture and commerce, and was made a viscount. The rebellion was not just forgiven, it was promoted, and in 1898, in Paris, the last peace fell into place. The Minister of War that year was a general named Charles Chanoine, the same Chanoine who had commanded the French military mission to Japan in 1867, the officer Brunet had sailed out with as a young captain. Chanoine appointed Jules Brunet Chief of Staff of the French army. 31 years after the two of them arrived in Yokohama, the man who had stayed behind was running the army he resigned from. Brunet retired into the reserve in 1903 and died at Fontenay-sous-Bois in August 1911 at 73. So what do we do with him? In 2003, Hollywood made a film about a foreign officer who trains a modernizing Japanese army, changes sides, and fights alongside the samurai against it. And that officer was inspired by Jules Brunet. But the rebellion in that film is not Brunet's. It is Saigo Takamori's, the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, 8 years later, a completely different war fought without him. The film took the Frenchmen from one story and the Last Stand from another, welded them together, and then put an American in the middle. The real thing is stranger and better. A gunner from Belfort, who finished 68th in his class, resigned from the strongest army in Europe because he would not abandon his students. He helped build a republic on a frozen island that 8 ships and 3,000 men could never have defended. He watched a Gatling gun end 1,000 years of one kind of war in about 90 seconds. He was arrested by his own country, forgiven by his own country, decorated by the country that had asked for his head, and he finished as Chief of Staff of the French army under the officer who first brought him to Japan. Did he stay because he thought he could win? He wrote to his own emperor that he could direct 50,000 men, and then he commanded 3,000 and lost. So no, he stayed because leaving would have made him the kind of man who leaves. 8 years after Goryokaku fell, another army surrounded another group of men who were not going to win, in the south at a place called Shiroyama. That one was led by the man who had taken Edo without a single battle, and then turned on the government he built himself. If you want the other half of this war, that video is on the channel. Tell me in the comments whether Brunet was loyal or whether he was a deserter, because I do not think there is a clean answer. And subscribe.